needs no introduction. Ron is quite a while member of our club. He is also our historian, and he's also the editor of our newsletter. Ron worked on this dig in Fort Calgary when he was a master's student at the university. He spent several months working in this area of expertise. Then he left this, and when he finished university, and went to work for the Glenbow Museum. He was a curator of cultural history there and spent 22 years there. He left that job to write books on Medalta. Then, after some time, he took another job with the Stampede Board. He worked for the Stampede as their historian for 10 years and then retired. And one of the things that I found interesting is that Ron does not collect anything for himself, and yet he belongs to the Collectors Club. He collects for other organizations and people. He explains to me that at some point in his career, it was a conflict of interest for him to collect stuff for himself, so he never got into that habit. And another interesting thing, that I found out about Ron is that one of the things that he discovered during the Fort Calgary dig was his wife, Tanis. No further comment necessary. Ron, welcome.
To Diane Bukowski, she's the one that worked most with me. She's in charge of the collections here, collections manager. In addition to her, several people helped pull these items out of storage, and it was a trying time for her because they're right in the midst of rethinking the museum and a big expansion program underway and whatnot. So this was a bit of a pain in the ass to do it, I might say. And I'll ask Diane to introduce other members of Fort Calgary that are with us tonight. Thank you.
So this is my assistant. She's Ann Penner. She's the collections assistant here at Fort Calgary. And tonight we also have our president and CEO here, Sarah Jane Gretzner. She's sitting over here.
Basically, a curriculum
is a curriculum hard to age it.
Oh, no, you just leave it on the rating for it.
Mine's worse. The secretary.
Poster ones from
So with that, I'd like to get right into the slides. Tonight, presentation is on Fort Calgary, and it's all about how it was built, how it was found, and the artifacts that we found. The reason that Fort Calgary ultimately ended up here where it is was because the federal government determined that they needed the National Police Force to move into the West, to bring peace to the West, eventually to help sign peace treaties. But more importantly, their initial job was to shut down the whiskey trade. And that they did in short order. Following their trek, the members, 300 strong, were raised in Ontario and Quebec. They signed up for 3 years. They got paid $1 a day. Wow. And eventually they ended up at Fort Dufferin in Manitoba. They trekked following just north of the US-Canada border to the other side of, just the other side of the present Manitoba-Saskatchewan border. From there they went up to Moose Jaw, Swift Current, and over to Medicine Hat. From Medicine Hat they cut down to the Cypress Hills or Sweetgrass Hills in the States. And from there they moved on over to catch up with the Fort Whoop-Up trail, and that led him up to Fort Whoop-Up where they wanted to shut down that whiskey trade. They got there to find out the whiskey traders had left, knowing that the police were coming. They continued on up to Fort Kip, also vacated, and then they eventually ended up at Old Man River at Fort McLeod. On an island in the middle of the river, they built the fort. This is a model of the fort that's in the Fort Museum today. As far as we know, it's a very accurate model because the sketches of the fort were actually filed in the official papers in Ottawa. So the original fort at McLeod has never been excavated because it was on the island. It either got covered up and partially washed away. So no excavations have been done there as far as I know. From there they decided the next year, that was 1874 when they built McLeod. From there they decided on 2 further forts, both of them about the same size as Fort McLeod, which was just over 200 square feet. So Fort Walsh in the Cypress Hills was to look after the Indian Métis in that area and their relationships with white settlers and so on. And the one at Fort Calgary was set up to be in close proximity to the Blackfeet Indians, who had a terrible reputation for being very hostile. So they left Fort McLeod in July, coming up, escorting first of all Jim McLeod, Colonel James McLeod up to Red Deer, who was on other business. In Red Deer they turned south and came back down to Fort Calgary. This, by the way, is a model of Fort Calgary. This was one that was made for a 1925 float. You'd think it would be accurate, but when you compare this with the accurate diagram out in the lobby or just up the hallway from the lobby of what we actually found, this model was obviously modeled after the Fort McLeod one, not Calgary. The one thing it does show, which is what we expected to find at Calgary, but we did get firm evidence, was the flagpole in the middle of the fort, not off in a corner as is depicted out here. Anyway, when they came back to Calgary, they arrived on the north side of the Bow River because they'd come down from Red Deer, and they looked upon a beautiful valley. Colonel McLeod had already had an expedition coming north, and he had determined the general location for the fort. They chose the confluence of the Bow and Elbow rivers because it was naturally defended by the rivers to some extent on all sides but the western side. So that is the area that they picked. They crossed the Bow using their wagons. They made rafts out of them and removed the wheels and floated everything over on the wagons. And they went about building up provisions for the forthcoming winter and everything. Buffalo were plentiful in the valley, in and around Calgary, east and west of Calgary. So they did put up some buffalo for the winter. They also built a boom to catch the logs, which would be floated down the Elbow River from some 12 miles up the Elbow River is where they got the pine and spruce trees to build a Fort Calgary. Because they were plentiful, they decided not to use the poplar because the logs are much harder to work with. So anyway, they continued on putting up other provisions. They built shelters for themselves while they're there. They had tents. The ones we found were inside the fort, not outside, but they would have built outside the fort area at that time. Some of them wanted subterranean pits for extra warmth, so they dug a pit foot into the ground so that you won't get cold wind blowing in underneath the base of it. And here they gathered firewood from up the river and around the area, floated it down dragged it to shore, stacked it up, making provisions for the winter. I.G. Baker, under a person by the name of Davis, was contracted to build Fort Calgary. He brought all the supplies up from Fort Benton. The supplies were, of course, bought further down the river at St. Louis, and ultimately, and supplies coming from Canada were taken down there and shipped up the Missouri River to Fort Benton. And from Fort Benton, they were brought up to Calgary. So he was contracted to put up the barracks, which consisted of two large barrack rooms, the quartermaster's store next, guard room, and some stables in the back. John Glenn, a local resident, one of the first in Calgary, and Sam Livingston was another one that was here quite early. John Glenda was commissioned to build fireplaces, particularly the stone fireplaces in the barracks room and in the officers' quarters. At first the floors were just bare earth, and later on they added boards and whatnot. So this is a layout of the fort, schematic layout. To my left is where the two buildings are, the officers' quarters to the west and the guard room to the south. And down below that on the east side is the part that we actually dug. So you can see by far the majority of the fort was under McCosham's warehouse. That's a large triangular building that is drawn over the fort. All of the back half, if you project the McCosham line straight down to the east, everything on the right-hand side, on this side, is the stable areas and the other bastions. All that was bulldozed off, making the railway bed coming into McCosham's warehouse. It was obvious after we did the dig that we found out Davis had a plan in mind. If you look at this drawing of what we actually found, you can see that the post molds, it shows the buildings, the big one at the south end, and you can see there's a couple of spaces left. Those were spaces left for the doors. If he didn't have a definite plan in mind, they would have just put a trench in and then put the posts up, and you know, you wouldn't pick that up. So obviously he came with a plan in mind, maybe based upon what had been done at Fort McLeod, we don't know. As you can see, there was no external entrances. I don't know what side you're looking at. I may be looking at it backwards. I guess on the right side here, it's a solid wall, and that's the outside wall. The doors were always on the inside. Anyway, he had a plan in mind, and he went about constructing it, and that started in August. 6 weeks later, he had all those buildings up. While they were putting up the buildings, the constables were also put to work, and it was their job to add the missing parts. So they had to put up the palisade connecting all of the buildings of the fort and also the gates. So that was their job. This is a picture of one of the stable areas in the back of the post, as far as we know. We assume it's a stable. It's vertical post construction, so we know it's one of the early buildings. You can see a horse sticking out of the building, so presumably it was a blacksmith shop where they did the shoeing and horsing around, looking after the horses. This is a picture of the external part of the fort. Remember, he said that they cut the spruce logs 12 miles up Elbow, they floated them down the river, they caught them on the boom, they snagged them and dragged them up to shore, and then they plunked them in trenches that were 3 feet deep. In fact, we found out the trenches were only 2 feet deep. So it wasn't a very substantial fort, obviously. If you look at this picture, you can see a couple of people in the center of it, kind of leaning against the wall, and assuming that they are close to 6 feet high, maybe 5'10", I think it is safe to say that it was 12 feet above the ground. You can also see from this picture that it wasn't a picket-style top of the fence. The top had been cut off and a board laid across the top horizontally. Okay, I.G. Baker Company submitted their invoice for digging the fort, and it was for the amount of $2,476. Now the payment was for square feet enclosed. They thought that's what they had done, which was over 9,000 feet, just short of 10,000 feet enclosed. And they're talking about the actual building enclosures, not the total area within the fort, because that was much larger. The fort turned out to be 220 feet square. Excuse me. Colonel James McLeod, he had to approve all payments, so he disallowed some of it, saying that they only enclosed 20 feet. I suspect the difference in what they calculated was one that their own men put up one of the minor stable areas in the back, and it could also be the difference between the guy doing the building is going to maximize by measuring to the outside of the building, and the bureaucrats are going to measure the inside of the building and save a few dollars. And they also got extra payment because they had thought they were only going to have to bring the lumber just a mile, from less than a mile away, and they had to cut them 12 miles away, so extra cost, they got additional $1,000. This invoice shows the payment. Payment came to Fort Benton, and from Fort Benton up to Fort Brisbois, later called Fort Calgary. Brisbois received the money. You can see he got, I can't read the amount on the screen here, but the top invoice is for $823, it looks like, and that was a payment that he had to make to the men. And they got extra pay, the $396, I think it says, and that was for the extra work that they had to do building the palisade. The second and third invoices show the actual currency that was shipped up. It was Government of Canada currency, and they acquired shin plasters, $2 bills, $5 bills, and $10 bills. So this is a couple of shin plasters. I stole the pictures from the internet. We obviously didn't find any paper goods at all. Well, we did find some, but not money. And this was the $1 notes. And can you imagine if they had put away 1 month's pay of these mint $1 bills and shin plasters coming out of Ottawa, dated 1874, what they would be worth today? I wish I had an ancestor that was at Fort Calgary that had the foresight to hide his money in a book that I finally ran across. Anyway, this was interesting too. Later on, Canada introduced a $4 note. So you can see now it was 25-cent shin plasters, dollars, $2 notes, 4, 5s, and 10s. So $4 note, that would be even worth more than the $1 note, because they didn't last very long before they did away with that one. Wanted to give you an idea what it costs. So this is the cost of freighting to bring stuff up to Beaufort. 42, the second line, 42,900 pounds cost $429.46. So 1 cent a pound is all that they were charged. Hell of a way to make a living, isn't it? one cent for all that work and all that distance is hard to believe. Everything had to be bought. Some was bought locally, some were shipped up from the US, but most of the beef, they had put away buffalo beef they were able to buy locally. There were some ranchers in the area, so they were acquiring that. This one shows a variety of the things that were shipped up, brought up from Fort Benton, probably by Davis when they were actually doing the building part. Nails at that time were sold by the pennyweight. So if 4 kegs of 10 pennyweight nails, I can't see the cost, but pennyweight nails, we went to the fine, reliable source of Montgomery Ward catalogs from the 1880s and found out that the pennyweight sizes, the 10 pennyweight is a 3-inch, the 12 is 3 1/4 inches, and 8 was 2 3/4 inches. If you look at the rest of this list, I'll leave it there for just a few seconds more. You can see the variety of items that were shipped up: shovels, lamp parts, you name it, a little bit of everything. Files, of course, shoeing bits and pieces, farrier equipment, wicks for their lamps, and even sashes for the door windows. This was kind of a fun record I run across. Can you imagine that they had to pay $22.50 for 1 ton of hay, yet the men only got paid $30 a month for nothing? So MacLeod had to explain why they paid so much. Well, it was because this one was for Fort Walsh. They had to build a road across the Cypress Hills to get it to there. So, of course, they had to pay through the nose for the building of the road, and they hid it in the cost of the bales. This is a record I compiled showing the occupancy of the fort. In 1875, there's roughly 50 men under Brisbane. A couple of other officers arrived at Fort Calgary and spent the winter there and built it. 76 it had fallen to 37 in total. 77, 27, and 78 it actually increased in number, and that's because a troop came up as an escort troop and stayed there for a while. And the following year it fell to 13, and by 1980 it was almost closed, just a few people keeping it open basically, and 1981 it wasn't much more, only 8 people. In 82, by that time, most of the original fort was torn down. The new barracks were built, and so the number of people staying there increased steadily, and from 64 in 82 to 100 in 1985. This is the group that came up in 78 when the population increased that one year. They're on parade, and people normally face the flag, and that's why I say the flag's in the middle of the post and not in the corner. I use the corners for going out late at night for other reasons, not to face the flag. Anyway, you can see the vertical construction buildings in the background. You can see the pith helmets all the men are wearing, and you can see the Winchester rifles. We know the date of the photograph because they did not receive those rifles until 1878, although they were in fact the 1876 Winchesters. So the new fort was built from 82 to 1940. The first buildings that were erected were the large barrack rooms, and then they added officers' quarters, a hospital, and so on. The kitchen was attached to the barracks room. This shows the first building, the barracks room, and the buildings on the left side, the 2 vertical post constructed buildings. Those are the ones that were part of the original posts. They were torn down within the year, but these ones had been refurbished in early 81, and they didn't last very long. What's interesting about those buildings, it's one of the few views taken inside. You can clearly see the doorways in those 3 buildings, and whoops, I can't go back, but those doorways, they match up with what we found on the scale model. So anyway, this all led to, I should say the slide I skipped by showed a schematic of the later fort, and basically it went all the way from right down to the Bow River confluence. Along 9th Avenue, some of the buildings were close to 9th Avenue, right up to 6th Street. So it was over, the square was over probably 10 times larger than the original fort. It was really spread out, giving them much more room. And they needed that, of course, because of the expanding needs for a better hospital and the better barracks for the men. So in '68, we went in search of the fort. Now, Alderman Eyre wanted to do something for the forthcoming Calgary centennial in 1975, and he wanted to know what, if anything, survived of the original building. The other thing that was happening was a proposal for a major roadway along the river, which would have gone through Inglewood, and he certainly wasn't in favor of that, and some other people weren't, but they did want development. So Hugh Dempsey worked with them. They lined up all the photographs they could find of Fort Calgary. Almost all of the shots that show the overall fort were taken from Scotsman's Hill. When you looked at the background on the other side of the street, the river, I should say, the Bow River, you could kind of line up where it was, positionally wise, east-west, but you couldn't really get a good perspective on where it was in the north-south alignment. So that's what we were looking for. In this photograph, the big building in the middle is all McCosham's warehouse. At the very far right-hand end, you can see the empty area. That's the area that we ended up digging in. In the first year, in '68, we were there only for 2 weeks, and we had to look in a cut bank, which was between the scrap yards and McCosham's. So you can kind of see a pile of old junk, towards the top of the photograph. Well, that was the scrapyard there. That lower part of the terrace had been dug out. It was some 8 feet lower than McCosham's. So we had a nice clear-cut wall to look at. And this was the wall. I don't have any really good pictures of this, but at the left-hand side, you can see some stuff sticking out in the wall. That manure band ran for a couple of 100 yards along there. And in it we found some ammunition, some square nails, but one of the most important things we found was an outhouse. What falls in an outhouse stays in an outhouse. And it's a great place for archaeologists to look. And we found this blob, and at the very top there's a little piece of copper adhering to it. We did recognize it for what it was worth as a pith helmet. So of course our imaginations run wild. We, as an archaeologist, we try to put everything in context. So he said, oh well, there must have been a two-holer here. It was wide enough to be a two-holer. And the guy had to go quickly out of the stable area, so he quickly ran in there, took his hat off, forgot to check that it was covered. Oh, what am I gonna do now? So much for that pith helmet. So anyway, that led to the major search. We knew that Fort Calgary was there somewhere, so the next year more money was put up in 1969. At that time, we had a change in the mayors in Calgary. Jack Leslie was replaced by Rod Sykes. Alderman Eyre, who started this, was still involved, as was Hugh Dempsey. So we started the excavations in the area at that end of the warehouse that had now been cleaned of all of the storage units, old vehicles and whatnot in it. At the bottom end of the photograph, you can see the two initial trenches that we did. This is when we were looking for the fort. We're looking for disturbances in the undisturbed soil, in the part that wasn't plowed, so we had to remove the top 6 to 8 inches of gravel and plowed up zone. And once we got down below that, we started looking for changes in the earth. The raw clay, undisturbed clay, was quite white, yellow, in contrast to the trenches that had been filled with humus material. So we're basically looking at the left-hand side where it truncates. That was right from the wall of McCaution's, and we worked our way. These are 5-meter square pits, by the way, so the total area that we ended up excavating was 1,100 square meters altogether. But that didn't happen until the next year. So anyway, we were about to give up. We'd been there 2 weeks, and finally we got to the right-hand end of that test trench, and we came across a cross-cutting trench. And from there we started following it down to the north and then down to the south, and true enough we found fence posts. So now we knew that we had remnants of the fort. Just below the right-hand side you can see a cross-section. That is actually where we got really lucky. We found one of the brass spikes off of a helmet. And here's the brass spike that we found. The brass spike was eventually put on the pith helmet that Harold Hussey of the Glenbow Museum had put back in shape, more or less, with a few missing parts for display purposes. And as they explored, looked more and more for it, we found more and more posts, as you see here. Colin Poole was one of the workers. By the way, in '69, all we had was a contingent of 4 students, and we had various volunteers from the Archaeological Society show up for work every once in a while. More posts found. This slide shows that you have the corner. He's sitting next to the doorway of the one building, close to it. And if you follow the line towards the top of it, you can see where it turned. So this was part of the palisade. Eventually, we found the outside wall, and this is what it looked like. And at this point, we had now spent close to a little bit over a month there, because once we found out that initial trench, while we were out of money, Hugh Dempsey went back to Glenbow and got additional funds to keep us going for another 3 weeks just to make sure that we had positive proof that this was indeed the fort. And you can see in this picture the crates and old trucks and whatnot that were still partly within the area. They largely cleared them out, but not everything. And then before the next year, of course, everything was covered up. We laid down plastic and backfilled dirt over everything. 1970, the search for we opened up the whole area, taking a closer look at things. This was our crew at the back. Is Colin Poole, Veronica Gadd beside him, Tana Sherman beside her, husband and wife couple, Ray and Joanne Kenny, Anita Campbell in the middle of the hole, Judy Logan, and yours truly sitting on the ground while everybody else is standing around. Anyway, Judy was kind of giving us a little indication of just how deep that pit was, but we hadn't gotten when this picture was taken to the bottom of it yet. This is the feature that we eventually thought was a storage room, a nice cellar, or a vegetable storage cellar. So this is what it looked like when we finally opened up the area and exposed it all. At the top right-hand thing, you can see that cellar feature. I don't really have very many good pictures of that. Now, in front of the building there, you can see these round circular pits. There's 2, 4, 5 of them coming down, and then at the bottom there's a couple in front of the buildings at that side. These turned out to be a landscaping feature. When we actually dug one of these, which I'll show you in a minute, we found plants remnants of the bushes that had been planted in them. One of the interesting features that we found right up against the building, that big dark thing to the left, is what was called a hole for a dead man. A dead man is where they dig a large pit, they put a big heavy board, like a 6x6 board, 6 feet into the ground, and from there they anchor ropes running to the flagpoles, just like they do today, anchoring power lines and so on, with guide lines running to the ground and anchoring them to keep them from falling over. We only found one. This is the only proof we have, and it wasn't enough at this point to say that this is where the flag was, but it could have been the flagpole from the later fort, but I think it's the one from the original fort. Anyway, at the bottom side, the other feature you can see are some half circles. These were bell tents. It had nothing to do with the area was used for World War I, and tents were placed in the area, so that's what they relate to, not the original fort. Whoops, I think I skipped by one, but anyway, the artifacts, these are some of the things we found, some of the things you see up there, all kinds of glass bottles, they're beer bottles, there's kind of torpedo bottom, well, they weren't really a torpedo, but rounded bottles, lots of Perry Davis bottles, the little, and you can see the different tops. Somewhere the early ones had the blob tops, as the two center ones do in the top line. Here's a Perry Davis bottle top on the left-hand side, and a tiny little medicinal bottle of some sort, could have been a veterinary or human, we don't know what was in it. But the Perry Davis vegetable painkiller, which was invented or introduced in 1845, there's lots of it there. And out of curiosity, I wanted to know why, so we found out because it contained opiates and a large amount of alcohol. This formula is secret. I don't think it was ever written down anywhere. If it was, I couldn't find out what it was other than the general thing. But if you had a earache or a toothache, you could get rid of it in a hurry with a Perry Davis vegetable painkiller. The bottle on the right, I think we found one with a paper label on it, and it said something about Hudson's Bay Sweetwater, but I never tracked down what that was. Couple more bottles and a ceramic bottle that we found. Everything was shattered, only a few things we tried to piece back together again, because there's thousands of glass fragments. Nails, lots of them, the top two rows. The middle row, more nails and some screws, and then you get bolts, and you get a variety of things. Close-up of the nails. The second row down, the left-hand side one, that is actually a boat nail. You can see the little barbs at the bottom. It was made of brass so it wouldn't rust and it wouldn't pull out of the wood. Beside it are some horseshoe nails, and as you can see, all the square nails, these are the ones from the original fort, and they are hand-forged tops on them, square bottoms, machine-cut bottoms, but with the tops prepared by a blacksmith. It's not advancing. Okay. We also found lots of modern nails, that's the top ones, and then tacks and whatnot, and lots of buckles. Here's a close-up of the buckles. Some of them were brass. You can tell those on the left-hand side. The ones that were metal are very, very rusty and badly preserved. The top one on the right, the two in the bottom towards the right. Oh, gee, some of the slides, I gotta remember not to hold it. Anyway, one of those buckles was for suspenders, we think, or some other type of equipment. And the other one with a piece of leather attached was probably one of the buckles, a belt buckle. We found other metal goods, and in this case, we have the brass rivets and washers, and these were used in the harness working and in some of the equipment. The bottom row was pen nibs and little tacks for keeping the papers together. At that time, you got to remember that it was a bureaucracy. Every letter that went out to Fort Brisbois, Fort Calgary, had to have a minimum of 5 copies. One going to Fort McLeod, probably filed there. Others, one kept in Fort Brisbois, one to the original person it was written to, others going to Ottawa. Sometimes there's more copies. So you get lots of stuff that was used for that purpose. Other things we found metal-wise were keys. The brass one is the top one in excellent condition. The item on the right looks to be part of a lamp with the hole in the middle being distinctive for a wick. We found personal objects, a straight razor, toothbrush. The bottom object, it's a piece of bone with a short piece of metal, rusted metal at the left-hand side. Exactly what it was used for, I don't know. Someone said it was a parasol, but I find it hard to believe a mounted police running around with a parasol in his hand, but you never know. Maybe some of you would recognize it. Sorry, and can tell us what it is. We found a little pendant and other things, some of which were seals. The 2 bottom ones we actually identified from those catalogs as to seals that were put on tobacco cans, chewing tobacco cans, and they were actually smaller than the kind of scallop-shaped piece shown in the top row, far right-hand side. I just blew them up here so you get a closer look at them. We found lots of ceramics. Most of them were very small. You couldn't really identify them. You could see that the one was Alfred and somebody company, another one was probably Marmalade, but the fragments were too small and too few that we could really do anything with them. In the later dig, they actually found some of the Northwest Mounted Police china, so they were more successful than we were. Pipes, clay pipes, the top one in the center is a short clay pipe. They had long stem pipes, the one at the bottom, and then we also found some wooden pipe bowls and some pipe stems that may have been plastic, maybe amber, we don't know, they were never tested. This is the ink bottle that we found. It's being restored. It's one of the few pieces where it was pretty well all there. This one was made by Arnold, P&J Arnold of London, and the record we found was actually 6 bottles bought from AP Sample and Company, but ink was ordered quite a few times, and it shows you that bureaucracy always required an awful lot of writing. Buttons, all kinds of them, from metal ones to bone ones to shell ones and so on. But what we really wanted to find were these, and I'm sorry the photographs are so bad. The top row are examples of the mounted police buttons that we found. The one on the right is the very first button, only used for half a dozen years. It just has a crown, a Victorian crown in the middle, Northwest Mounted Police on the top. The 2 at the left-hand side are the next button, which had the buffalo head in the middle, and Northwest Mounted Police below. The brass ones made by Smith and Wright were taken from the internet to show you more clearly what they look like. The button on the right, when one of the visitors saw it, he got quite excited. It's a militia button, but he told us it's a very rare one with the 3 cannons on it. And it would have been used by someone that was part of the militia in eastern Canada that joined the mounted police and brought it west. They could wear their original uniforms if they remember the militia until they were replaced by mounted police uniforms, which they didn't get for a couple of years. So it was a hodgepodge of dress in the first few years. We found this chain link and we determined that it's the link used on the pith helmet to chin straps that they'd hold around the neck. None of the cloth behind it was preserved, just the links. We found hook and eyes. This picture shows where they were used up at the collars. Notice all the braiding around the collar, the brass stuff, the large button just below it, and of course the collar dogs on either side. In this case, only one's there. The other item is the belt loops. You can see on the jacket to the left, about halfway down the jacket, there's a couple of loops. We found some of these, and that was to hold a snake belt buckle that they wrapped around the middle of their uniform. You can also see the two large buttons where they were used not only to button up the front, a couple of extra buttons were on the back for whatever reason. Of course, the smaller ones were on the sleeves of the jackets. We found this object on the right, which was metallic, and we think it's part of the button used on top of the pillbox hat. Probably the officer style of the pillbox hat being of brass. This is some of the braid we found, and this is the braid that the other picture showed around the collar. This is where some of it would be. The smaller fragments on the right, we're not sure just what they would have been used for. Ammunition, we found lots of it. I don't have a picture of the first gun they had, but the bullet remnants, second one over top, from the top left, is probably the Snyder Enfield 577, the first rifle that they were issued. From there, in '78, they got the 45-75 Winchester rifle. The shell casing up at the top left is that. And we found a little cache actually of 45-75 Winchester rifles. There must have been 30 of them, all never fired. Why they got lost and where we found them is hard to know. Maybe they hid them for some reason. Anyway, fortunately they were all safe. Been enough deterioration that the powder had deteriorated and the lead, of course, had deteriorated. The second row shows some of the shell casings and ammunition, some of it unfired, like the one on the far right of the second row. That's actually a .22 cartridge, but we did find 38 and 32 cartridges. But what they had at the time of the fort were the two pistols that are shown in the bottom right-hand side. The top one is the Adams .45 caliber revolver, and the one at the bottom is the Webley revolver, .455 caliber. You could actually shoot the .45 ammunition in the .455 as well, so they were cross purposes. This one caused a lot of excitement when it was found. The Joy Parlor, Clancy's Joy Parlor. Imagine what came to our mind. Anyway, I had to leave all the workers working while I ran down to Glenbow to check it out. I was so disappointed to find out that it was a penny arcade. Here I thought we'd found the first evidence of the red light district, and right in the middle of the mounted police barracks. Oh, what a disappointment. Coins are always a fun thing to find. The ones shown in here are 2 10-cent pieces. The first one, 1882. The second one on the left is the 1870 10-cent piece. The bottom one is a 1885 5-cent piece, or not called a nickel at that time, but 5-cent piece. Other coins we found was 2 quarters, Canadian quarters, I think they're 1871. Can you see the dates on them up there? I can't on here.
1880. 81 and 83.
81, okay. Anyway, they were the Canadian quarters that we found, a couple of them. The ones on the right are another dimes. On the bottom right is we found 2 American half dollars, 1877, and we found a couple of American nickels and a bunch of US pennies. What's interesting about the US dollars is, remember they were paid $1 a day. If you lost half dollar, wouldn't you go looking for it? So we took this as some evidence that it was likely floorboards in there, because they found within the building, and they probably dropped, and there's no way they're going to tear down the fort looking for the officers wouldn't let them do it if they lost it. And if they'd known they lost it, they would have taken a look for it, but once it fell through the floorboards, it was probably gone. But that's a lot of money to lose at that time, one day's wages. We also found some British coins. This was, you can't hardly see it, but it was actually a 1914 one. The top one was what we found, but from the internet I'm showing you a 1911 one. It's a British threepenny piece. We found a couple of other British coins too they don't have pictures of. Okay, going back a second, the features that we found. Remember I mentioned that these things were landscape feature. You can see how they line up. The fact that they're so far removed in front of the building makes sense, because we think what was probably there in front of the buildings was a boardwalk. Rather than walking through mud, we suspect that they had boards that they could walk on from one building to the other, so that they wouldn't have to, once the grass came or whatever, maybe it was grassy enough that they didn't have to have, but originally they would have something like that. And I mentioned the other features, but here's the cross section of that particular feature. It's about 2 feet in diameter, 18 feet deep, and as it said, there's evidence most of them were lined with manure to help encourage the plants. Anyway, at the end of that dig, we had an open house, and we wanted to show the public what we'd found. We want to get advertising for the preservation of the site and so on. So we put up boards, we put on displays of artifacts. The bottom left-hand one shows a case with artifacts, the bottom one on the right, a bunch of pictures and site plan and photographs, and just generally the crowds. Of course, after we were all, before I go on, I should say one of the things that happened at that time, of course, the media came out. And this was my first contact with media. Up to that time, I'd worked in different type of sites, like Head Smashed in Buffalo Jump and excavations along Willow Creek and so on. So Fort Calgary was something new for me. But the media came out and we wanted to show them the evidence. Well, who do they run to? They take a look at what we have, and they happen to find a couple of old guys that were in their 70s, and they interviewed them. And what do you recall of Fort Calgary? As if they would know, you know, this is 100 years later. What do you recall of Fort Calgary? Well, those stupid archaeologists, they're digging on the wrong side of the river. I remember the fort being over there on the other side of the elbow. I don't know what they found here, but it sure isn't Fort Calgary, we can tell you that. They just want controversy. I tried to avoid the media after that, all possibilities, every time. Anyway, when we were all done, we covered up the whole site with 4mm plastic sheeting, a foot of dirt on top of that. Meanwhile, the city acquired all the properties in the area, tore them all down, cleaned up the area, and then finally Oresco, an archaeological salvage company, was hired to excavate the fort, and that was under McCosham's warehouse, and that happened in 1975 and 1976. So you can see the part that they excavated again in the schematic. You can see the rectangular building superimposed over it. So they actually got very lucky because they found the whole bastion area in the southwest corner, a good portion of the barracks room, the officer's hut, and a larger portion of the guard room than we found. They also found the gate between the two buildings on the left-hand side. The stable areas, all that was gone, wiped out by all the later construction, so none of that was there. Altogether, we found less than half of the original fort. Oresco determined that the fort was just shy of 220 square feet, not 150 to 200, as was recorded by the people that wrote the books. That southwest demi-bastion measured 45 feet long and 12.5 feet on the short side. The main gate on the south side was 12 feet in width, so that's a very large gate. They could obviously run carts in and out. The two buildings on the east and west sides of the south side, the officers' quarters, each of them were 51 feet by 20 feet. We never got a full measurement on the two long buildings, the barracks room and the part we did, because there was destruction there, but they turned out to be roughly 140 feet in length. And this is the crew before we broke up, and we showed you one before, but you're probably wondering why everybody here is kind of looking at Tanis on the left-hand side. Well, if you look closely, you'll see that my left-hand arm is not exactly visible. They tell me, and I didn't remember this, that I was sprinkling dirt down the back of her blouse. It must have been a good sign, because this is where we met. And within a couple of years we were married, and we're still married after all those years. Thank you very much. So,